Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I was thinking about this before we started recording. Imagine that feeling, right? Like the walls are closing in. And it's not because you're actually sick, but because of all the things people are doing, trying to keep everyone safe. That's sort of the vibe, like this tension between being protected and being isolated. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, this feeling. In our deep dive today, a look back in time with a really interesting history book. It uses plagues to show us how messed up societies can be and how those problems just keep coming back. So if you're into that kind of deep thinking stuff, hit that like button and subscribe because we do this kind of deep dive a lot. We're diving into A History of the World in Six Plagues by Edna Bonhomme. And we'll put a link to that in the description for you. This book isn't just like, oh, here's a list of all the bad diseases. It's way deeper than that. Like, how do societies freak out when things go wrong? How do they treat people who are already struggling? And sometimes, how do people find a way to be strong even when everything is terrible? It's pretty intense stuff.
One of the things that really hit me as I was reading this book and thinking about us talking about it is how the author starts off. It's not with some big historical overview, it's personal. She tells this story about getting typhoid fever when she was just 4 years old, back in 1988, at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. And the way she describes it, you can almost feel how alone she was. A little kid in a hospital, everything is scary and confusing, stuck in this room.
It's like you can't really understand big ideas like disease and isolation until it happens to you,
Right.
right? And she talks about lying there, not able to eat anything, hearing all these weird sounds at night, and how her parents would visit, but then they'd have to leave, and she'd be totally alone again.
Yeah.
That feeling of being trapped, it really stuck with her. And you can see how it shapes how she sees everything that comes later. Something I think is really interesting is that they kept her in the hospital for a whole month. And it wasn't just to help her get better. They were worried about her spreading the disease too.
Exactly. And this one little story, then it takes you to a bigger story. The book talks about how back in the late 1800s, typhoid fever was a huge problem in America. Like, people were really scared of it. It makes you think about Typhoid Mary, Mary Mallon, and how afraid people were of getting sick from, like, normal stuff like food and water. They ended up keeping Mary Mallon away from everyone else because they thought she was spreading the disease without knowing it. It's kind of similar to what happened to Edna as a kid, even though it was so many years later. People being isolated when they're sick. This idea keeps coming up again and again throughout history.
It's so weird, right? Like, we know so much more about diseases now, but we still react in some of the same ways. The book talks about how it's kind of unusual for someone to get typhoid fever in Miami back in the 80s. Most cases were from people traveling from other countries. So Edna getting sick, it was kind of a fluke, but they still isolated her even though it wasn't that common anymore. Shows you how some things just stay the same even when the diseases themselves change.
So, we start with this personal story, and then the book just goes deeper into how sickness and how societies deal with it. It's all tied up with things like inequality, especially the awful history of slavery. There's this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois about freedom and slavery, and it sets up this whole idea of two different worlds: the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick.
And this is where the book gets really intense, right? It makes you think about how medicine and doctors, they weren't always just about helping people. Sometimes they were part of the problem, like with this idea of plantation medicine. During cholera outbreaks, among enslaved people in the 1800s, it wasn't really about giving them proper medical care. It was more about keeping them under control, keeping the system of slavery going. So the point isn't just that these enslaved people suffered during these outbreaks, it's that the doctors and medicine were used to oppress them. They made it seem like it was about health, but it was really about power and control. It makes you realize how messed up things were.
One of the most disturbing things to think about is how people tried to use medicine and science to justify slavery. It's just awful. Like, there was this doctor, Dr. Cartwright. He said slave cabins needed to be cleaner during cholera outbreaks. But the conditions enslaved people were forced to live in, they were horrible and unsanitary. It's so obvious that he was just trying to protect the slave owners, not the people who were suffering. This is a perfect example of how knowledge, even medical knowledge, can be used in really bad ways to keep powerful people in control instead of helping those who need it most.
And then the book talks about what it was like for enslaved women specifically. And it's just heartbreaking. Not only were they dealing with the threat of disease, but they were also being controlled in other terrible ways. They were at risk of not being able to have children, having miscarriages, and they were always in danger of sexual assault. There's this story about Harriet Jacobs. The book mentions her story, and it really shows you how vulnerable enslaved women were and how badly they were treated. It's hard to even imagine what they went through.
But even with all that awfulness, there's also this amazing story of resistance. Enslaved people found ways to fight back. Sometimes they would risk everything to escape and be free. Other times it was more about small acts of defiance, like refusing to do what they were told. Even in the worst situations, people can find ways to hold on to their humanity and fight for their dignity. It's inspiring in a way.
And after slavery was finally abolished, it's so cool to read about how people were trying to build a better future. Like, they started the Freedmen's Bureau, and they created medical schools, specifically for black students, like Howard University and Mary Medical College. These were huge steps. It shows how determined they were to fix the problems that slavery had caused, especially in healthcare. It's all about taking control of your own health and well-being.
But the book also makes it clear that just ending slavery wasn't enough. There was still so much racism, even in medicine. And like Malcolm X said, it's not enough to just stop doing the bad thing. You have to actually heal the wounds. This is something we still struggle with today, right? Black communities still face so many problems in healthcare. And knowing this history helps us understand why.
Then the book jumps to a whole different place in time, East Africa in the early 1900s. And this guy, Robert Koch, he was researching sleeping sickness. What's interesting is how he went about his research. It seems like he was more interested in the science itself than in the people he was studying, like the Luan and Maasai people. He didn't really try to understand them or their culture.
Yeah, and the way he set up these labs and camps to treat sleeping sickness, it raises some big ethical questions. Like, he used this medicine called Atoxyl, even though he knew it could cause serious side effects. People were losing weight, going blind. They'd even banned it in Berlin because it was so dangerous. But he still used it on African patients. It makes you think, was he really trying to help them? Or was he just using them for his research? It's a disturbing example of how colonialism and science got mixed up, and how people in power can abuse that power, especially when they're dealing with people from different cultures.
And it gets even worse. Koch wanted to quarantine whole areas to control the disease. But this is during colonialism, remember? So it feels like he was trying to control the African people, not just the disease. Makes you wonder, were these public health measures really about helping people? Or were they about maintaining power and control?
And if you think about it, this connects to a much bigger issue. People like Angela Saini, they've argued that the way we understand biology today, it's rooted in this history of colonialism. So we have to re-examine people like Koch and what they did. Should we still have statues and plaques honoring them? It's a tough conversation to have, but it's important.
And this all leads us to more recent times. The book talks about the HIV/AIDS crisis and how Haitian immigrants in Miami were treated so unfairly in the 80s. They got labeled as a high-risk group just because they were Haitian, called them the 4-H Club. And this had terrible consequences. People lost their jobs, couldn't find housing, just because of where they were from.
It's so messed up, right? People were terrified of getting sick. And they took it out on Haitian people. Many of them were already struggling, trying to make a new life. And then they were pushed even further to the margins of society, forced into these specific neighborhoods like Little Haiti. It's a reminder that even today, fear and prejudice can easily get mixed up with public health crises. And it's usually the most vulnerable people who suffer the most.
And then, of course, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. It really showed us how unequal our society is, like with lockdowns, right? They were supposed to keep everyone safe, but they really hurt people who were already struggling. If you didn't have a safe place to stay or couldn't afford to miss work, lockdowns were a disaster. The book talks about prisons, too, how they're like breeding grounds for diseases.
And the way prisoners are treated, it's just wrong. Like, they don't have access to basic health care. Kathy Boudin, she was an activist at Bedford Hills Prison back in the 80s and 90s working on HIV/AIDS issues. She saw firsthand how bad things were. Prisons are just not set up to deal with these kinds of health emergencies.
It's crazy, right? We lock people up, and then we don't even give them the basic care they need. The book uses Rikers Island as an example, a place with terrible conditions, and it brings in the ideas of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's all about abolishing prisons. She says we should get rid of them entirely and focus on helping communities, not locking people up. It makes you really think about what justice means and how we treat people who are already on the margins of society.
To show you just how complicated it can be to deal with epidemics, the book takes you through the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, specifically what happened in Liberia. The healthcare system was overwhelmed, they didn't have enough resources, and so many healthcare workers died trying to help people.
And the government's response, like the lockdowns in places like West Point, they used the military to enforce the rules. It made people distrust the authorities. Some people even started to believe that Ebola wasn't real, When the government isn't transparent and doesn't communicate clearly, it creates chaos and makes it even harder to manage a crisis.
And it's interesting to compare this with how people dealt with plagues in the past. Sometimes communities would quarantine themselves voluntarily. It's all about trust, right? People need to trust the authorities. And when that trust is broken, it's really hard to get it back. The book also talks about how the media covered the Ebola outbreak, how it sometimes made things worse by reinforcing stereotypes about Africa. We have to be careful not to further marginalize communities that are already suffering.
But even in all this darkness, there are stories of hope. The book tells about people in Germany during COVID-19, like Rose. She's a sex worker, and she had to find new ways to do her work because of the lockdowns. Sandra, she was seeking asylum, and she had so much trouble getting basic health care. Imagine that, needing medical help and not being able to get it. And Ava, she's a cancer survivor. She had to be extra careful because of the virus, but she found peace and strength in nature.
These stories are so important. They show you how different people experience these big events and how even in the midst of a pandemic, people find ways to be resilient, to adapt, to connect with each other. Even in the darkest times, there are moments of light. And the author, she talks about her own experience too. Getting married during the pandemic, finding joy in a time of uncertainty. It's a reminder that life goes on even when everything feels upside down.
And even when things are calm, like when the author went to the colonial in France, she couldn't escape the feeling of history. Like, the past is always there, even in beautiful places. It makes you think about how everything is connected, how we can't really escape the past. It shapes who we are, even when we don't realize it.
The book ends by taking you back to the fight for justice, the fight for everyone to have decent health care. It talks about the cholera outbreak in Haitian prisons in 2022 and the horrific conditions these people had to endure. People like Sagwen's Bernabe, who was deported back to Haiti and had nothing. These stories are a punch in the gut. They show us how much work we still have to do.
And the book connects this to James Baldwin's letter to Angela Davis. It's such a powerful letter. It's about how connected we all are, how we can't be truly free until everyone is free. And it ends with this huge question. Why do we ignore the suffering of others? Why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? Why do we keep locking people up, exploiting them, and neglecting them? It's like we're stuck in this cycle of cruelty.
And the final message, the one that really stays with you, is this. Just surviving isn't enough. We have to fight against the things that cause suffering and death. We have to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Everyone deserves access to health care. Everyone deserves to live a full and healthy life.
So that's our deep dive for today. Thank you for being here with us. We went through a lot, right? Thinking about plagues, history, and what it all means for us today. We were inspired by Edna Bonhomme's book, A History of the World in Six Plagues. What parts of this resonated with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you know someone who'd be into this kind of conversation, share it with them. Let's keep talking about these important issues. One last thing to think about. We talked about how plagues and social justice are connected. What do you think? What's our responsibility to change things, to create a society where everyone is cared for and treated fairly, even when things are calm, even when there's no crisis? It's something to think about.